r/NoSleep. Hosted by you/PerleyBrook. Birthday. Part 1. Today is my birthday. I'm turning 26. Which I guess is a strange age. I wouldn't know. Maybe every age is strange, bringing with it its own expectations and uncertainties. Questions like, am I far along enough in my life? Or, should I be meeting someone nice and starting the process of settling down? Or, do I need a new car that better represents me? These aren't the questions I ask myself. I try to not think about where I am in my life relative to anything. I block out my birthday. I haven't celebrated it since I turned 16. That's the night when everyone who mattered to me was murdered. The wind is gusting hard and something is rattling against the window of my 25th floor apartment. I look out and up through the tall glass in my living room to see what it is. The window cleaning crew left their scaffolding. A cord is dangling down, clacking against my window as the wind flings it from side to side. Staring out into the night from a high rise that sits well above the surrounding city can feel a lot like staring into a murky ocean. You start to see things. Shadows and shapes. I always believed that if you gazed into the abyss long enough and imagined something very clearly, that thing would appear. If you look into the underwater depths and imagine a giant squid or a great white for a while, you will summon one to you. If I stare into the darkness for a long time, can I draw him back out to find me? I think so. That's why we're here. That's why I'm having this birthday party. Are you ready to start? Agnes Ramey asks me. I don't answer her. I want to make her wait a little longer. I've made her wait years for this interview. What's a few more minutes to really soak it in and build the anticipation? As soon as we talk about that night, things are going to come out. I know Agnes isn't the killer, she's too weak and status driven. Feline. She's very calculated in a way that serves her ego, and she's made a success out of herself. Off of my tragedy really, but who's to blame her? Her drive isn't brutal. Blood doesn't stain her hands. She just wants to be rich and internet famous like the rest of us. When I turn to Agnes, I can see that she's laid a digital recorder out on my coffee table. She's holding a wireless microphone and gesturing for me to come to her. Fuck it. It's go time. Let's talk about the massacre. Let's get it all out. Let's dig and probe the bloodshed. Let's find out how human and flawed all of the victims were. Let's care about them before we hate them and blame them. The world thinks that the killer died that night. I know the killer is still out there. I'm going to prove it to everyone. I walk to Agnes and she attaches the microphone to my collar. I'm ready when you are, Agnes says. I'm ready. We sit in cushioned chairs across from each other. She reaches for the digital recorder on the table between us. Wait, I say. You're going to let me review the edit before the interview goes live to the world, right? Agnes purses her lips. Of course, she says. I don't really do any editing. I'm just going to let the interview play in its entirety on my podcast. My audience prefers a more gritty style. Don't feel like you need to talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. Agnes and I were friends in high school and she was at my 16th birthday party. She left early, before the killing started. She was one of the lucky ones. She wrote the first article on the tragedy for our school newspaper, relating the events through her first-hand perspective. She was close friends with many of the people who died. Some of us worked on the high school yearbook together. Due to the success of her high school newspaper articles, she started writing for our town paper, interviewing the families of the victims. She was a good writer and a better journalist, finding her footing through an emotional meditation on the tragedy that allowed her to process her grief and invite her readers into her journey. Her articles were really popular. She had a fluff piece that got picked up by USA Today. And then, 4 months after the so-called Sweet 16 murders, she launched her podcast, Yearbook. It was a detailed, day-by-day, minute-by-minute deep dive into the killings. A lot of it centered around me. And not just because the massacre happened at my birthday party. And that my parents and best friends were among those murdered. But because my boyfriend, Sean Hollis, was the one accused of the killings. Sean was shot down by the police. He was carrying a chopping knife and wearing a ski mask when he died. He was covered in blood. He was 17. Sean didn't kill anyone. Yearbook played out all of the scenarios and motives. And by the end of its 3-year run, with nearly 80 podcast episodes covering the Sweet 16 murders, it definitively concluded that Sean was the madman maniac who butchered 8 people at my family's home. His apparent motive was straightforward and as old as time: heartbreak. The popular version is that I had dumped Sean the morning of my birthday, and as a vengeful, twisted present to me he went on a killing spree and took away everyone I cared about. The podcast was the first one to dub him Lonely Boy. The podcast's highly active message boards coined me Red Maggie, and that stuck too. I stayed away from the online community and their theories. But I got recognized all the time. At the supermarket, the movie theater, the coffee shop. People would stop me on the street and ask to take pictures. One guy even approached me in the parking lot of the public library and said, "Since Lonely Boy did it because you broke up with him, it's kind of your fault, right?" I jumped into my car and raced away so fast that I almost ran into a dump truck. Sean didn't do it. He couldn't have. It wasn't who he was. I might be the only one who believes that he wasn't Lonely Boy. The real killer is still out there. Hello, yearbookers. And welcome back. It's episode 297, wow, and I'm joined by a very special guest. In fact, I'll go so far as to say that this is the most significant guest we've had in the podcast's 10-year run. After the first 80 episodes covering the Sweet 16 massacre, Yearbook moved on to other killing sprees and mass deaths with the same level of microscopic detail that made its format such a hit. It's been top of the true crime charts for more weeks than any other podcast, and hits the overall #1 anytime a new season drops. Agnes has covered the Sharon Tate murder, Jonestown, the Hale Bopp cult, the Sea Captain slasher, the Smiley Face killer, and dozens of other notable death events, both recent and historic. She's made millions optioning her coverage to Hollywood, with 3 series and 2 movies that have been made, and 5 more in the works. Agnes Ramey is a podcasting, media superstar. If I cared enough to hate anyone, I'd probably hate her. And until tonight, I was her only holdout. I was her great white whale. Boys and girls, tonight we're going to get lonely. I cringed inside as she continued her intro. It is November 5, 2021, 10 years to the day of the Sweet 16 massacre, the tragedy that inspired Yearbook. And I am sitting in a luxury, high-security skyscraper building in Boston, in the apartment of Maggie Monroe. How are you, Maggie? The blood rushed to my head. I took a sip of water from a glass on the table next to my chair. I'm fine. We both broke out in nervous laughter. This is crazy, she said. Yes. It is. Where do you want to start? She asked me. I didn't care. I invited her here because I knew she knew things that she wasn't telling me. That she wasn't telling anyone. I wanted to find out why. She'd been dying for this interview and had requested it dozens of times. I never responded to her inquiries, not once. Tonight, I'm going to find out who the killer is. And Agnes is going to help me. She just doesn't know it yet. We can start wherever you like. Great, she said. Agnes smiled and let her shoes drop off her feet, curling her legs up under her on the chair. She was always petite. A gymnast from the 8th grade on. I remember being amazed at how well she could spring and flip wherever she went. Let's start on the morning of your 16th birthday. I took a deep breath. I woke up earlier than usual that day and asked my mom if I could join her on her morning walk. When we got back 45 minutes later, my dad had made blueberry pancakes, my favorite. We took our time eating breakfast. My mom and dad were Delia and Mark Monroe. They grew up together in Cumberland Flats, which is a few towns over from my hometown of Brindley, Vermont. They were high school sweethearts and never dated anyone else before getting married. I was their only kid and they spoiled the heck out of me. My dad was a lawyer and my mom sold real estate. They did well enough to buy an old farmhouse on 20 acres, which we were slowly converting into a vineyard. That was the long-term plan. We were going to make wine as a family and create a tasting room for visitors. We had a lot of stuff that we needed to get for the party, so we took my dad's pickup into town and made a few stops. Did you see anyone in town? Everyone was always interested in what happened in town that day. It was the last time my parents saw anyone outside of the party attendees. We saw a few people. Mary Dominov at Hanson's supermarket. She was buying cat food and talked with my mom for a few minutes while my dad and I shopped. On episode 29 of Yearbook, Agnes had interviewed Mary Dominov. She was my mom's friend from the local real estate scene. She was a first-generation Russian immigrant, who had moved to Vermont with her ex-husband, Bert Halsey. Bert went to Florida after they split. Mary was a sweet lady. She related her conversation with Mom and it was all about the upcoming summer rental season on Lake Muskogee. Nothing very exciting there. I waited in the car when my dad went into the drugstore to pick up the balloons and decorations that he had ordered. And then we went to Home Supply Hardware to buy a few more folding tables and some other stuff. Home Supply is where Sean worked, right? Agnes asked. Yeah. Did you see him? She was asking questions she already had the answers to. She just wanted to hear it from me. He was working that morning. He helped us load the tables into the back of our truck. Did you talk about anything? Sean and I broke up a week before my 16th birthday. We had been together for 5 months. It was the first relationship for either of us. Without understanding what we were doing, we had become hopelessly codependent and isolated from our friends. I didn't feel like I knew myself enough yet to be that close to anyone, so I cut him loose. We had gone to the movies on Halloween night, and afterwards I asked him if we could take some time off. He wasn't angry. He was in shock. We didn't talk on the ride home. He called me a few days later and I could sense the agony in his voice. All I remember from that phone conversation is him telling me, "I know I don't need you, but I feel like I do." Sean came from a tough family situation where his father had abandoned him when he was 5. His mom had had a string of boyfriends after that, bringing someone new into the house every few years. It took me a while to realize that history had created a deep instability in Sean. That our relationship was about him trying to find some calm and a love he could count on. I had pulled the rug out from under him. I was 15 and he was only a few months older than me. I'm pretty sure we would have bounced back and found each other again if we had had the chance. After he went into the store, my dad gave me $5 and said he had forgotten to tip Sean for his help and could I run it in. So I did. We had broken up a week earlier and things were kind of chilly between us. But when I saw him inside, I gave him a hug and asked him if he was coming to my party. What did he say? He asked me if I wanted him there. I said that I did. And then I gave him the $5 and told him he could buy me something with it. That was the last time I spoke to him before he showed up at the party. Was he mad? Or acting weird? No, he was smiling. He laughed at my joke about the $5. Agnes spoke to her audience. The hunting knife and ski mask that Sean Hollis used at Maggie's party were from the store where he worked, Home Supply Hardware. Did he take them off the shelf before or after this encounter with Maggie and her parents? She paused the digital recorder and quickly explained that she was going to be doing these brief asides from time to time in our interview, to provide some additional context. Does that bother you? She asked. I shrugged and she turned the recorder back on. There's no record of Sean buying a knife or a mask, I said. It would have been easy enough for him to steal them. I didn't want to get into a debate with her about whether Sean was the killer or not. If I did, the whole interview would devolve into that. Agnes and her legion of listeners were wholly convinced that Sean was guilty. And that I was the impetus for his killing spree, the one who broke a boy's heart and pushed him to become a psychopath. Words weren't going to convince them of anything otherwise. They already knew how I felt. I sat quietly, staring at Agnes. She went on. So you brought everything home and set up for the party? We did. We decorated our barn. My dad had an old stereo system in there with a bunch of his albums. We set up tables and chairs. The plan was to hang out and eat, do a little dancing. And then follow that with a bonfire once it was dark out. Nothing fancy. I remember getting there a bit late because I was lost, Agnes said. It was my first time driving to your house on my own and all those old farm roads were really easy to get turned around in. We had balloons marking all the corners. I know, it was my bad. I was a very nervous driver when I first got my license. Once I finally pulled in, there must have been a dozen other cars parked in the field next to the barn. And all the food was gone. There was some food left, I replied. She was painting the same picture that she always painted for her audience when recounting her experience. She showed up late to my party and all the pizza was gone. She hung out for an hour and then left with our neighbor, Terrain Beckwith, to go over to his house and get something to eat. I'm pretty sure they did more than eat at his place, especially with Terrain's parents and younger brother at my party, but Agnes was careful not to go there. She was good about making it her story, without ever making the story about her. I don't think she even got lost. She was hooking up with Terrain in her car down some dirt road, and using my party as cover with her parents. Which, normally, wouldn't have bothered me one bit. When you're a teenager you create all kinds of fictions. But any inconsistencies surrounding the mystery of my life felt very relevant to me. Like I said, Agnes was hiding something. Maybe a few things. But I guess if you weren't hungry, I went on, you might have stuck around. And who knows what would have happened. I think about it every day, Agnes said. It's forged my life's path. Mine too. Do you want to talk about what happened during the bonfire? When the murdering started? Can we pause for a minute? Sure, Agnes said. She stopped the recorder. I called down to the building's front desk where Travis the nighttime security guard was stationed. Is everything all right, Ms. Monroe? Travis asked me. Yes. We're running a little behind. If any of the other guests show up, Can you have them wait in the lobby until I call? Shouldn't be more than another 10 minutes. Of course. Just let me know. I thanked Travis and hung up. Agnes turned the recorder back on. You're expecting someone? She asked me. It's my birthday. I'm just having a few people over to celebrate. I'd love for you to stick around. I have a whole dinner planned. The least I could do is feed you at my birthday party. Finally. I smiled. I knew Agnes couldn't resist the opportunity to share in the experience. Red Maggie's birthday party, 10 years to the day of the Sweet 16 massacre. The ensuing yearbook episode would explode. That's wonderful, Maggie. I'd love to stay and meet your friends. She already knew everyone who would be attending the birthday dinner in my apartment. She'd learn that soon enough. Where were we? Oh, right, the murders. You can talk in as much, or as little, detail as you like about them. I'll tell you everything the way that I remember it. I was sitting in the back of my dad's pickup with Piper DeWitt and Sean. Sean said he was leaving. We had gotten along well at the party, everything was okay. He got me a gift. A silver heart locket with your pictures inside. That's right. I opened a drawer in the side table and pulled out the locket. I dropped it down with the chain in my hand so that the heart dangled for Agnes to see. This locket. That's the Lonely Boy locket? She asked. I don't call it that. It's the locket that Sean gave me on my 16th birthday. Wow, Agnes replied. She held up her camera and took a picture of me, holding the locket out. I laid it on the table between us. She couldn't keep her eyes off of it. He left early because he said he didn't want to pressure and crowd me. Not that night or any night. Not anymore. He realized what I'd been going through and why I asked for space. He wanted us to be together when the time was right. The last thing he said to me was, I will see you whenever you're ready. It started shortly after he left. About 10 minutes later, Piper said to me, I think someone fell down. She pointed to the bonfire area where our neighbor, Mr. Beckwith, was lying on the ground. I heard my father shouting. But he wasn't shouting for help. He was shouting at someone in the shadows, just outside the fringe of light the bonfire was putting off. That's when I saw the killer race out from the darkness and bury his knife in my dad's chest. Twice. I started screaming. The few people left moved from the barn in time to see the killer kick my father into the bonfire. Dad caught fire first and then he fell on top of Mr. Beckwith. I ran to find something to put them out with. Your mom was in the kitchen. She was on the ground. I rolled her over. The killer had cut her eyes out and slit her throat. She wasn't breathing. I'm sorry, Agnes said. I got up and walked to the kitchen sink and poured myself a glass of water. I was struggling to breathe, let alone talk. A humming tone had built up, emanating from the back of my head in waves that were making me feel nauseous. I hunched over the sink and coughed up phlegm. Drank some more water. After a few minutes I returned to Agnes in the living room. Are you okay to keep going? She asked. Let's keep going. The gory details had already been laid out in detail by Agnes' audience, who had somehow gotten a hold of the autopsy reports for all of the victims and published them on the yearbook message boards. There were sketches and animated recreations posted. Even fan art depictions of the horrors. The theory is that Sean went after my parents first because he blamed them for us breaking up. Which was complete horseshit. I think the killer went after my parents because it was their house, and they were the only ones, other than me, who knew how to communicate with the outside world. Our farm was in a remote area with no cell reception. You could call into town on our landline, which had been cut, on a satellite phone that my dad kept for emergencies in our garage, or by using the CB radio in my dad's pickup. If you were trying to get a signal on your own phone, you were out of luck. I was frozen and kneeling by my mom when I first saw the killer. He was a lot bigger than Sean. A hulking, full-grown man. Agnes nodded sympathetically. I knew what she was thinking. This is the part where Red Maggie goes into denial. She's still unable to accept the fact that her ex-boyfriend was Lonely Boy. It wasn't until he swung at me with the knife that I finally snapped out of the daze I was in. I rolled under the kitchen table. When he pushed the table aside, I ran back out the kitchen door. I remember feeling like I was in a dream. Like when you're trying to get away from something bad in a nightmare and your feet can't move fast enough. You're caught in quicksand. But I must have been running faster than I realized because I collided with Mrs. Beckwith outside. She stood up and jumped away from me. She had this crazy, confused look on her face. It took me a moment to realize that she was working to put out the fire that had engulfed her husband and my dad. She was swinging a blanket over them, but it wasn't doing much good. Her younger son, Lee, was frantic and crying. He kept spinning around, like he was looking for help. The Beckwiths were our closest neighbors. They lived in the neighboring farm, which was about a 5-minute walk away. Dean Beckwith was a 4th-generation tree farmer, and their fields were lined in pine, spruce, and fir. Janice Beckwith was my 2nd grade teacher. Their youngest, Lee, was only 12. He liked to fish, and I'd oftentimes spot him cutting through our yard to get to the nearest brook. He was a good, quiet kid. "You remember Toraine, don't you?" I asked Agnes. "Of course. We were friends." Agnes left it at that. I knew they were more than friends. Toraine Beckwith was the kind of darkly handsome young man that girls who are looking for trouble are drawn to. I never thought he was a bad guy. He was a loner, a couple of grades ahead of us. Toraine and I were both on the cross-country skiing team and had crossed paths around the farms. But he always kept a cool distance. He struck me as someone who was trying to figure out where he fit in. He didn't have time for the normal chutes and ladders of the high school social scene. He was too busy inside of his own head. Toraine never made it to my party. At least, not that I know of. But his parents and little brother did. I was trying to tell Mrs. Beckwith what was happening, but I couldn't get the words out. She pushed me away and kept fighting the flames running over her husband when the killer stabbed her from behind. I remember watching her as she fell to her knees. She had a confused look on her face. She didn't see the knife coming. But Lee did. He was standing next to me. I instinctively put my hand over his eyes as the killer came around with another blow, burying his knife in Mrs. Beckwith's right ear. Then I grabbed Lee's hand and we ran. "You ran right to Ryan Masterson," Agnes said. "Yes. I could see a car idling at the end of our driveway. When Lee and I got there, I opened the door. Ryan fell out from the driver's seat. He was still alive. There was a stab wound in his neck, right through Adam's apple, but he was managing to hold the wound enough to keep breathing. I pushed Lee inside of the car. I had to stop again. I went into my bedroom and sat on my bed. The guests would be here soon. I needed to pull myself together and keep going. The truth would come out tonight if I had the courage to keep digging. I could hear my mother's voice in my head, urging me on. When I got back to Agnes, she was pouring 2 glasses of wine from a bottle she had found in my kitchen. She handed me one. "Here, this should help," she said. As soon as Lee was inside of Ryan's car, he freaked out and started driving away. He just panicked and left me behind. But he didn't get far. He crashed into a ravine next to our driveway and got stuck behind the wheel. "You didn't see Lonely Boy kill him?" Agnes asked. "I didn't see him get killed, no. I was trying to help Ryan when the masked man caught up to us. That's when he got me here." I held up my left hand, revealing the deep gash scar running over my palm. Agnes raised her phone again, taking another picture. "I'm pretty sure he would have gotten me then, but the killer got distracted." Amy Donovan and Luca Jonesy were driving through our side field in Luca's car. They made it onto the road. The killer stared at them as they got away. They drove straight for the police station. "That's how the cops found out what was happening," Agnes said. "I thought Piper must have been in the car with them. But when I ran back to the barn, I found her face down. She wasn't moving." I would later find out that Piper DeWitt, my best friend for as long as I could remember, had seen what happened to Mrs. Beckwith and tried to fight the killer away with a garden rake. She was stabbed 7 times. I could feel him coming. So I ran into the barn. "And then Sean started calling your name," Agnes said. "No. No one ever called my name. Mark Ansell said that as he was hiking out through the back of your property, he could hear Sean screaming your name in a crazed way. Over and over." Mark Ansell was my father's friend and our high school history teacher. He claimed to have been in the bathroom when the madness broke out. After finding my mother in the kitchen and realizing that our phone line was down, Mark went outside where he found my dad and Mr. and Mrs. Beckwith, dead and still smoldering in a heap. The way he tells it, after that he panicked and cut through the woods behind our house to an overgrown snowmobile trail that led into town. He claims that he heard Sean screaming my name as he hiked away. For a few years, I was convinced that Mark Ansell was the killer. He had a size and frame comparable to the masked man. In high school he had played football and liked to regale anyone who would care to listen about his acts of physical prowess, both on and off the field. He was genuine and friendly around the family, but I caught him leering at some of the older girls in the hallways on more than a few occasions. He was a guy's guy and mildly creepy. I always felt like my dad was only friends with him because my dad was a nice guy and Mark Ansell was really assertive, always nagging him to do stuff. I never got the sense that my dad had much fun spending time with Mark. Sure, they'd go fishing or bowling or throw horseshoes at the fire department. But it was like Dad was checking a box, hanging out with other men, when all he really wanted to do was work around the farm, spend time with mom and read. After considerable reflection that bordered on obsession, I talked myself out of Mark Ansel being the killer. He was too dumb, frankly. He didn't come off as a calculated sociopath or even someone who was hiding something. I'm pretty sure he had a violent streak. But it was coarse, the kind of meanness that was prone to coming out in traffic altercations or in a shouting match with someone smaller than him at a sporting event. He wasn't a madman. He was just a blowhard. And a wimp. He snuck away and let others die. He was the one person at the party big enough to really confront the killer, but he didn't. Instead, he went on countless talk radio shows and did interviews with the media, bragging about how he survived while proclaiming, with certainty, that Sean was lonely boy. He had Sean in class and even said in one interview that he had seen it coming. Agnes had him on yearbook a few times. They even did a special roundtable episode with survivors of other horrific events, really pumping up their experience and embellishing their involvement in the Sweet 16 massacre. Truth is, they both bailed early. They survived because they weren't there. Agnes was gone and probably porking Terrain Beckwith before anyone had been killed. I'm almost certain that Mark Ansel ran out the back door as soon as he came upon my mom in the kitchen. When I got into the barn, Sean wasn't around. And by then, I'm pretty sure that Mark Ansel was long gone. "Why did you go into the barn?" Agnes asked. "As a kid on the farm, I did a lot of climbing. The surrounding forest was filled with an amazing array of trees and boulders to scramble up and my parents encouraged it. They even sent me to climbers camp when I was 10. I was good at it. I had ninja'd my way to the top of the barn dozens of times, when no one was around to get mad at me. It was an easy ascent. I knew the killer couldn't get to me if I made it onto the barn's roof. I was trying to find a place to hide. I didn't think the killer could reach me on top of the barn." "Did you see him setting it on fire?" "No. But I heard him carrying gas cans from the garage. Didn't take long for the smoke to get heavy. I couldn't breathe or see. I laid down at the edge of the barn, trying to find some air. But the fire was coming through all around me. I felt dizzy. And then, without thinking about it, I jumped. When I hit the ground my eyes were stinging so bad from the smoke that I couldn't see. I ran with the heat of the fire behind me, reasoning that I was heading down our driveway. When I heard the sirens, I collapsed. The police raced in. 2 of them stayed back with me while another pair of officers ran towards the house. 3 gunshots rang out. And then I heard one of the police officers say, "We got him," over the walkie-talkie. "You ran back to see him?" "I ran back because I wanted to know who did this." "What did you see when you got back to your house?" The police were crouched over Sean. He had taken 3 gunshots to the chest. He was covered in blood. The killer's ski mask was laying on the ground next to him. And he was holding the hunting knife. I had suffered burns over my face, neck, and hands. A local journalist snapped a picture of me as I was leaving the hospital the next day. I looked like I had a terrible sunburn. That picture is the one that the yearbook message boards used when they referenced me. Between the burns and all of the bloodshed I had encountered, the nickname Red Maggie was quick to arrive. But that wasn't the only reason why Agnes fans and conspiracy theorists loved calling me Red Maggie. There was a segment of them who believed that I was the one who put the idea into Sean's head. Of him dressing up like a masked lunatic and butchering my friends and family on my 16th birthday. The theory didn't make any sense. Some attributed the idea to me being in concert with a witch from the forest surrounding my property. It was epic bullshit, but a lot of people believed in epic bullshit these days. "I'd like to tell your audience something," I said. "Of course. Sean wasn't the killer. He wasn't Lonely Boy. He was a good guy." "Who do you think the killer was?" Agnes asked. "I'm not certain. But we're going to find out. Tonight." Agnes tilted her head and gave me a puzzled look. I called Travis at the front desk. "Have any of the other guests arrived?" I asked him. He answered. "Great. Send him up."